Welcome to Arrows on Air, presented by Tomorrow's Air. I'm Christina Beckman, and this is a show about the other sides of climate action. Here we learn from the fascinating experiences of adventurers, artists, storytellers, and scientists who help show us not only the how of climate action, but also why it's worth the effort. Hello and welcome. Today we're in for a real treat. I'm chatting with Chloe Berge, a Vancouver-based journalist who covers travel, conservation, climate, and culture. In this conversation, we talk about things like rivers that can now sue to be free of pollution and the rights of nature movement, Chloe's upbringing in British Columbia, what it feels like to be charged by a mama mountain gorilla, the emergence of solutions journalism, and how too much gloomy news has sparked a new style of storytelling. Chloe shares the concept of rewilding and how it's playing out in Patagonia and Chile and in Scotland, where collective contributions from businesses, nonprofits, and travelers themselves are helping support Scotland's ancient Caledonian forests. Along the way, we also managed to talk about pianos in Siberia, modern romance, and the power of dating apps. Chloe's work has appeared in BBC, National Geographic, The Globe and Mail, Conde Nast Traveler, and many others. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Chloe, thank you so much for being with us this morning. I have been, as you know, tracking your articles on all different topics at the intersection of conservation and travel for a long time. I think I was first trying to get you on this show last year when you were about to get married. So yes. Maybe, I don't know if we still call you a honeymooner. It's probably been a year, but congratulations on that.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you for having me.
Yeah. Well, let's start with the Magpie River. This sure. Piece that you published in National Geographic caught my attention because I had just also read this article in the New Yorker about a river or a lake, Mary Jane Lake in Orlando, Florida, that is suing the city of Orlando to protect itself against development.
Yeah, well, like you, I mean, I think I forget where I first heard about the Magpie River, which was in Eastern Canada in Quebec, and being granted legal rights. But like you, I was just fascinated by the concept. It was something I hadn't heard of before, and kind of went down a rabbit hole myself researching it. But yeah, basically what's happening there is the Magpie River. It's on Innu First Nation territory. And
where is that?
So that's in the Côte-Nord region of Quebec in Eastern Canada. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So they call it Metaheko Shipu, which I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of. But, that river for them for centuries has been so important. It's been a natural highway and the source of their food and medicine. And it's been threatened by dam development. There is already one dam on the river, but it's they're sort of threatening to develop another dam on the river. And although dams are, source of renewable energy, they also can be quite destructive to the ecosystem. So to protect the river, the Innu First Nation worked with the regional municipality there and declared 9 rights for the river, including the right to sue, be free of pollution, and maintain biodiversity. So it can kind of, how it works is they will have 2 sort of representatives if they do ever go to court over an issue like this, representing the river, but it basically bestows these rights on the river as it would a person.
So fascinating. I looked into this, just a little, and I realized that the first time this topic, this idea that I want to say inanimate, but our natural world is not inanimate, but that these sort of natural entities would have standing was 1971. And yeah, so this quote from the Christopher Stone, the lawyer who wrote this article, he said, "This is partly because until the rightless thing receives its rights, we cannot see it as anything but a thing for the use of us, those who are holding rights at the time. I am quite seriously proposing that we give legal rights to forests, oceans, rivers, and other so-called natural objects in the environment, indeed to the natural environment as a whole. So that's been that's been puttering around for many years, right? But it
Yes.
hasn't
Yes.
really, I guess it can't catch on until you have, because these things can't speak for themselves, they all require a human champion, don't they?
Right, exactly. And yeah, no, it has sort of that, what's happening with the Magpie River sort of echoes this, what we call the rights of nature movement, which, yeah, you mentioned Christopher Stone. So he was kind of the first, he was a law professor, somewhere, American law professor, I think California. And yeah, he wrote that article, Should Trees Have Standing? And yeah, it's very interesting. I think basically, well, a lot of what he said in that article was sort of looking at exactly what you just said, sort of that rights are, a social construct, and they're fluid, and they're constantly changing. And so maybe this is the next evolution of that, is looking at natural entities and their rights, which is just a different way of thinking about things, right, than we do, at least in the Western world.
It seems so obvious, and yet it hasn't been obvious. So you're Canadian. I think
Yes.
yes. And where do you live?
I'm just outside of Vancouver, British
Mm-hmm.
Columbia.
So one of the most beautiful, incredible, majestic places. Do your colleagues and friends, and is this like how top of mind is this in your social and journalistic circles? Are people buzzing about it, or is it sort of like meh?
Yeah, I would say not very, to be
Uh-huh.
completely honest. I think most people that I've sort of shared the story with are still like I was when I discovered it, which was, fairly recently too, are still sort of surprised by it, but are very interested. And I think, how can you not be? I mean, just like the two of us, it's just so fascinating, and such a shift in mindset and the way we relate to nature and think about things, right? So I think there's definitely an interest when people discover it. I wouldn't say it's a hot topic necessarily, although the magpie has received quite a bit of coverage within Canada, and the issues that are ongoing there.
Mm-hmm. It seems like the subject is also very entwined with First Nations and Indigenous rights and voices. And so the timing is kind of great because we're in a moment where we're trying to elevate Indigenous voices. Do you
Yeah.
see, like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, most of these, well, I shouldn't say most, but a lot of the sort of rights of nature movements, and the movement to grant rivers legal rights in particular around the world, are Indigenous-led movements. And
Mm-hmm.
um, yeah, like I was just saying, I think when we're looking at sort of larger global climate issues right now, I think it's really going to be, we need sort of a fundamental shift in how we relate to nature. And I think that a lot of Indigenous peoples have thought that way for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
think I say in the National Geographic article I wrote, sort of relating to nature as an equal or as a sentient being
Mm-hmm.
is sort of fundamental to a lot of Indigenous peoples and their worldview and belief system. So I think, yeah, even for myself, I mean, I think I've learned a lot of that through Indigenous-led tourism and Indigenous experiences. And so, yeah, they're really, at the forefront, I think, of, showing us a new way to think about these issues.
Mm-hmm. Travel, right. And so this ecotourism and travel experiences are such a great way to collide the average person with
Yes.
the indigenous viewpoint
Mhm.
and the natural resources. And you're a travel writer. Are you a travel writer first, or would you say you're a nature writer first?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I would say I'm a travel writer, but quite often I'll have ideas, and I do actually have to think, is this a travel story?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Or is it a nature
Mm-hmm.
and conservation story? So I think sometimes I definitely walk that line. Um, but yeah, like you just said, I think that travel is a very it makes these conversations and these issues accessible, I think, to a lot of people that normally it wouldn't be, or you just maybe don't know anyone that's part of an Indigenous community, and so yeah, it kind of brings a lot of those issues into the mainstream, I think, and it has for me too. Like, I mean, I think that's really where I've learned about these things, and why I'm so passionate about Indigenous tourism is because it is so inextricably linked to, I think, conservation. That's sort of just inherent in a lot of their indigenous people's way of thinking and in their culture. So
yeah, I mean, I travel for me has been just this vehicle to come into contact with things that then capture my imagination and I have to pursue. Do you remember your first article, like how you got started in this path? Because now you're so established, and I wonder what got you going. What was the first thing that you wrote about?
Yeah, I mean, sort of in the travel space, it wasn't really conservation. I think the very first travel story I wrote it was an outdoors piece about Japan, and sort of, although that did sort of look at the intersection of culture and the outdoors. So I think I've always had that sort of interest. And that was for Canadian Geographic. So that was one of my first pieces. In the travel space, I've sort of worked in editorial for quite a long time. But, yeah, the interest in sort of conservation stories and travel stories that tie into climate, I would say it's really developed in the last sort of 3 years. Yeah, it's honestly it's still fairly new to me in a lot of ways. And it's really, they've kind of like, those interests have really developed side by side. I mean, I think I really got interested in conservation and climate through travel, really. Through, I think when I started travel writing too, you start taking trips that, you start looking for the story as opposed to just, going to a place for entertainment or to have fun, which is great sometimes too. But, so in doing that and looking for the story and where I wanted to go next, I think I just was naturally sort of exposed to a lot more of these issues. And so those interests kind of grew very organically and simultaneously, I think.
What was what are your parents like? How did you, I'm imagining your upbringing in British Columbia as being super earthy, but I realize I'm just making that up. I have no idea.
Well, in some ways it was. I think my dad has really, he loves nature and loves being outdoors. And so I think he instilled in me sort of a love of nature. And we did a lot of camping and hiking when I was young. And, even now he's retired, but he raises bees and makes his own honey. And he's always been very environmentally aware. And so I really think I have him to credit in a lot of ways for at least just a very fundamental appreciation for nature.
Right. Bees. So that means every time you go home for Thanksgiving, you've got all kinds of fresh.
Yes, I always have wonderful raw honey. We actually gave that out as little wedding favors at our wedding, as little jars. The best honey.
Good for him. I think beekeeping. So, I mean, I love it, and then I'm also very afraid of it.
Yes. Well, I'm actually allergic to bees. So
no kidding.
Bee stings. So it's like, okay, thanks, Dad. Yeah, my parents moved up to the Okanagan, which is sort of our interior desert region here. So before, he had sort of hives off on a farm here when we were close. When they were closer to Vancouver, but now he has his own setup there on his property, and no, it's great.
Is the Okanagan, is that that's also like wine country too?
It is. Yes, it is. So, and that's also where we got married. We got married at a winery, and it's a beautiful area. It really is.
How did you meet your husband? What's he do?
He's a teacher. He teaches grade 6, and we met on Tinder. I wish I had a better, more romantic story.
No, that is that's modern romance, man.
It is, I guess, right? Yeah.
And so you travel, I guess maybe, well, I don't know. Tell me, are you traveling a lot for projects, or how's that going as we move through these pandemic straits?
Yes. Yeah. Well, I have been on a few international trips now. So yes, I am traveling internationally again. I'm actually going to Africa next week.
Ooh, what's going on
Yeah.
there?
Yeah. So I'm going to Botswana and then
Mm-hmm.
up to East Africa to Uganda and Rwanda. Rwanda, I've been before, but they've opened a new gorilla conservation center there. So yeah, I've written about that gorilla conservation before, so going back to see that, and yeah, it should be a very interesting trip. And Botswana too, there's lots of conservation issues going on there with oil drilling sort of north of the country. So it'll be interesting just to see that landscape firsthand, and also just looks incredibly beautiful. I'm so excited for the wildlife there. And but yeah, no, so definitely traveling again. And for me, it's really I'd say I'm traveling less now, and not just because of pandemic restrictions and changes, but I am pretty picky about where I go now. I think when you first start in this industry, it is such a novelty, and it always will be, and is such a gift to be able to go to these places. So you kind of just want to say yes to everything.
Mm-hmm.
But it's I am very aware sort of my carbon footprint when I fly.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, there really has to be a story that will in some way contribute
Mm-hmm.
in a good way, I think, for me to be flying somewhere and sort of having that impact on the environment. And then also, I think it's just, for me, it's a balance. I mean, there are travel writers that are constantly on the go. And for me, I love home too. I always say I'm a world traveling homebody because
Mm-hmm.
I love being at home with my husband, and we have 2 dogs, and also just having the time to write too, and to be immersed in that. So yeah, I would say I'm traveling less now than I was at the beginning of my career.
Uganda, I recently learned a little bit about the mountain gorilla population there and
Yeah.
how that is sort of a conservation success story. And
Mm.
then during the pandemic, because tourism was down and local communities then were affected by that
Yeah.
poaching sort of
Yeah.
returned, like hunting for bushmeat, which was not a thing. Like we'd sort of overcome that, and now it's kind of back. And I was just reading about that like
Yeah.
last week. That are you familiar with the mountain gorilla trajectory in Uganda?
Yeah, I'm more familiar with it in Rwanda, actually.
Mm-hmm. Have you seen a mountain gorilla?
I have, yeah,
Oh
yes.
man, Chloe,
I,
I would just love it. Tell me what
oh my
like.
gosh. I mean, it really, I had tears in my eyes. It was a
Mm-hmm.
very, very powerful experience. I mean, they're just such beautiful animals.
And they're huge, right? Like,
They're huge. Yeah, exactly. I mean, they're powerful too. It's really sort of awe-inspiring being in their presence.
and were you like, what is this? Are you like hiding behind a bush with your binoculars? I mean,
Well, you're
I
not
don't know.
actually,
Set it up.
which is the crazy part, because they are habituated, and most of the humans, they don't interact with but are around. They're sort of used to
Mm-hmm.
human presence, and now
Mm-hmm.
thankfully most of that human presence isn't from poachers. It's from the rangers and people who are either working to protect them or research them. And I'm pretty sure in Rwanda, they have sort of constant surveillance from rangers. Now, like you said,
Mm.
maybe that changed a bit throughout the pandemic. But so yeah, so they're used to seeing people. So that's the wonderful part, is you can get, say at a safe distance, but pretty
And is
close to
everybody
them.
quiet, just like
Yes,
holding
you
their
have to be
breath?
very quiet. Yeah, so you're very quiet, no sudden movements, and they brief you before you trek up into the jungle to see them, and it's so
You walk
exciting.
up.
Yeah, yeah, you walk up. And so they kind of brief you briefly and sort of how to respond if, to
Mm.
various behaviors and the noises to make. There's sort of
Mm.
gorilla talk.
Oh my goodness.
Which I had an opportunity to put into use, and I didn't, because I actually was charged by a mama gorilla.
Stop, Chloe,
Yes.
little Canadian Chloe.
Yes, and I was doing
What
everything.
happened? Go back to the very beginning.
Yeah, well, it was at the end, and we were actually about to leave to hike back down, and it was just me and the ranger. For some reason, the two of us were up ahead of the group. And so I had my zoom lens out, but I was at a far distance from this mama gorilla and her baby. But I don't know, I guess she saw that lens and she did not like it. And so she came barreling down, kind of screaming, teeth bared. And really, that's all I remember, because the ranger did
Because
such
then you passed out.
blacked out. No. No, but the ranger was like just so on it, and he whisked me behind his back, and they have, like I said, their sort of way of speaking to the gorillas, so he was up on his tiptoes making the noises, and she backed down right away.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Was your heart just pounding?
Oh yeah. It was, and the weird thing is, it happened so fast. It was like, I was kind of more afraid after the fact, because it just happened so quickly. I couldn't even sort of process. I just remember seeing her teeth and like her running at me. So, yes. So, like I said, I mean, I wasn't getting too close, but you definitely, as much as they're habituated, we always have to remember that with any wild animal, they're wild animals, So, yeah, always important.
It's so intense. I mean, I really, the travel experience does sharpen your care and passion for these places, right? Like, even just hearing that from you makes me more interested in what could I do to help support the communities and the places that are conserving this. I think, anyway, it's like it's a never ending topic about to travel or not to travel. It seems like a lot of people coming out of the pandemic, when we didn't travel so much, and now we are more alert to the emissions impacts of flying. There's a lot of people just kind of saying, I think we should all stop traveling. And we definitely need to revise the frequency. I think a lot of business travel, but I don't think we shouldn't stop. We should still go some places and see things and have these like deep experiences, because otherwise it also goes back to what you're saying at the beginning, when we were talking about when you experience a place, you might then be inclined to help fight for it and give it, personhood rights. If things are known, then they can be cared for and protected. And if we're not seeing them, if they're not known, it's just so easy for them to get developed or extracted or.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I agree. I think that is the power of travel. It really is. Like you were just saying with my experience with the mountain gorillas, how could you not come away from seeing these magnificent creatures and not want to do something to protect them and protect the habitat they're living in? I mean, yeah, I think, until you experience some of these things and see them for yourself, it's sometimes it's just very abstract. It feels like a lot of those discussions around
right
environment and climate change, and yeah, and it's not just even seeing endangered species or ecosystems that are really precarious, but just seeing the vastness and diversity of the beauty of our natural world. I mean, when you see that, how can you not want to do something to protect it?
I think, and it's also, tourism can be bad. Too much tourism, right?
Yes.
Like, so I find the double-edged sword aspect so confounding, right? Because if everybody went to see the mountain gorillas, that would be a problem too. I think that's what we just grapple with, is it feels like we swing to such extremes, and every good intention opens up all these deeper questions, like, well, who should be able to go, and why can't everyone go? And if everyone goes, then it's destroyed too. And why should only some, these topics that are just so hard to navigate, and yet we should keep trying to navigate them rather than shut it down, I think is where I land.
Yeah, no, for sure. I agree. And it is, it's hard, I think, for destinations to develop sustainably and figure that out and, sort of navigate those issues. But I think that's also why we're seeing, from travelers, more of an interest in sustainable travel and how they can contribute to a place when they visit it. I think that's something that's really come to fruition over the past few years because people do realize, the impact of over tourism and want to at least be leaving a place a bit better. I think that's really become more popular, anyways, recently.
Yeah. Talk to me about solutions journalism, Chloe. What is this?
Yeah, so solutions journalism, it's a term I kind of came across last year, I think. And there's a solutions journalism network, and I attended their webinar with an initiative called Covering Climate Now. So they hosted a webinar. Solutions journalism is basically, I mean, when I first heard it, I kind of thought, oh, is this kind of like good news or good news journalism? And it's not. It's just sort of speaking about how, I think there was an Atlantic story that came out last year too, talking about how the vast majority of people are just so kind of disillusioned with the news. And there's a sense of overwhelm because it's always these doom and gloom headlines. And I think a lot of people have just sort of turned away from the news. And not surprisingly, they found that sort of stories that put a solution forward first could get a great response from people. And so that's basically what it's about, is sort of saying, here's this issue because it's important to know what the issue is and the gravity of it when we're talking about something like climate change. But okay, we're not going to leave the solution to the last paragraph at the end of the story. We're going to make it focus, I guess. And it's
that's
just
really interesting. That so we just had a session at one of our conferences on climate storytelling.
Okay.
And it was not, we didn't have the solution in that session, but we were inviting the conversation about what are some things we can do in our travel writing and in our travel experience design to bring forth the topic of climate in a way that is empowering.
Yes.
Versus, and so it's like there are scientific facts that you can relay, and you can also share local initiatives or, broad initiatives, or you can put solutions. I didn't know about solutions journalism or as a thing, or I would have brought that more into the session. I love that. So give me an example. Like, I know you've written a little bit about rewilding. Is that these stories probably are a great example of this kind of practice? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. And like you said, it's kind of, when you're talking about empowerment, I think it can just be paralyzing to hear about nothing but the negative stats, right?
Totally.
I think it's more inspired. It inspires people to action. It's much more galvanizing when you hear about sort of, what we're doing to change this. But yeah, rewilding is something that I was just very interested in learning more about, and learning about how travelers are sort of taking part in these rewilding experiences. So rewilding, basically, from all the scientists and experts I've spoken to, it's basically a sort of holistic, synergistic approach to ecosystem restoration. So it's not looking at, a more siloed activity like tree planting on its own. It's sort of looking at the removal of invasive species, plus reforestation, plus reintroducing endemic species, and basically getting back to a whole healthy ecosystem.
So removing invasive species means like some crazy weed.
Well,
example?
yeah, it could be that in the most of the cases that I've sort of written about, for instance, I was just in Chilean Patagonia and I visited the new Patagonia National Park there. So in the invasive species there was livestock. So sort of,
Oh.
yeah, so through
Hmm.
the, and maybe you wouldn't actually call that an invasive species, but
Hmm.
through the last century, sort of agriculture developed to the point there where the land was totally degraded. You don't have healthy soil, so nothing's growing. And then, of
Hmm.
course, there's habitat loss. There's not the habitat for the endemic species of that part of Patagonia. So, uh, a nonprofit called Tompkins Conservation sort of
Hmm.
it was a decades long project, but to basically remove all the livestock, and they sort of re-employed the farmers that were working on these ranches in
I mean,
rewilding.
huge effort, huge
Oh gosh,
community, right? Like going to
well, that's
people and saying, we need to take, we need to stop doing livestock. We need you to, it's so complex, right?
Yeah, complex and controversial because, I
Hmm.
mean, you talk about a place like Patagonia, it's just so
Hmm.
ranching and all of that is so integral to their livelihood there and their culture and everything. So yeah,
Hmm.
quite controversial, but so over a few decades, they kind of worked to remove those ranches, remove all of the fencing. And then it was kind of a combination of, once all of that was gone and there wasn't the threat of the cattle and the sheep, certain endemic species started to just come back naturally. But then they also worked to do some conservation breeding and actually reintroduce some species into the landscape. And yeah, so it was this really really ambitious, huge project that when I found out about it, I was like, I have to see this, and I've
Hmm.
been wanting to get down there since like I don't know, I guess that was 2019 when I kind of first heard about it, and then the pandemic happened, of course, but I was able to get there this March, and it was just so beautiful to see an ecosystem that really is thriving now, and there's still a lot of work to be done there, but it works. It's for sure sort of a solution that works for ecosystem restoration. And
And the
yeah,
organization down there is called Rewilding Chile. Did you? And I also know one of our Tomorrow's Air supporters is uh, the Raffaele Di Biasi, the head of Birds Chile. Did you go on a
okay.
tour? Did you see what was that like? I would love to see it.
I didn't. So I actually stayed at the Explora Lodge in the park, and they sort of do
Mm,
work with rewilding Chile.
hmm.
So most of it was just getting out into the landscape and seeing some of these projects and seeing just how the landscape has sort of changed.
You didn't get
Um,
charged by anybody.
no, I didn't get charged. No. The guanacos, which are the wild Patagonian llamas, they're just so sweet. And yeah, they're very docile, no charging.
Right on.
Yeah. But yeah, no, it's a rewilding is, it's not limited to Patagonia either. It's happening all over the world in Australia and yeah, sort of other parts of the globe. So it was actually put forward as part of the United Nations Declaration on Ecosystem Restoration, or a decade of ecosystem restoration is what they called it. So I think, yeah, more people are sort of seeing the value in rewilding and mitigating climate change and restoring these ecosystems.
It's such a gimme for travel, right? If you're it seems like a very accessible thing. Tell me if I'm
Yes.
wrong, for
Yeah.
somebody visiting a place to ask about whether there's a rewilding
Yeah.
initiative going on that you might engage with in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've written a couple of pieces on it. And the story I wrote for Conde Nast Traveler, because like many of these terms that kind of come on the sustainability scene, I wanted to sort of dive into what actually is rewilding. Are travelers
Mm-hmm.
actually helping, or is it just a way
Mm-hmm.
for people to kind of feel good about visiting a place? But no,
Mm-hmm.
travelers can really make a real impact in these projects. One of the things that sort of came out of all my interviews for that piece was just that a lot of these projects are really underfunded.
Mm.
So, and sometimes they just can't get the manpower behind what they need to do. So, quite often they will engage travelers, whether it's setting up trail cams or collecting some sort of data that's really valuable to the conservationists and scientists working in that area, and really makes a real contribution. So,
Did you go to Scotland also? I did
Yes.
scan that article, which is a beautiful piece. So yeah, you were in the Scottish Highlands too. What's going on there? What are they
Yes. Yeah.
rewilding?
Yeah, so the Scottish Highlands was actually has been called in the past the ancient Caledonian Forest. That's what it was called by the Romans, and it used to be one of the sort of most biodiverse, richest forests in Europe. And same thing. It was a combination of both deforestation and agriculture over the last century, which is a pretty common trend in all of these cases. It's like it's the last century that has really done it. But has been sort of decimated the landscape. And so it's interesting because when we sort of have this idea of what Scotland looks like, and I always have, and I've always wanted to go there. So I did travel
Castles
there.
and people in
Yeah,
kilts and ragged cliffs.
right,
Waves.
right. You get these sort of images, at least for me,
Mm-hmm.
of these, headlands and rugged,
Mm-hmm.
mountains and these sort of vast open spaces. And we call that wilderness, or that's what we
Mm-hmm.
think of. And, most of the people I spoke to there in the Cairngorms National Park say, well, there's actually very little wild left here. This isn't how it's supposed to look. It's actually supposed to be very forested, and there's supposed to be a lot more wildlife here. And so
Mm-hmm.
what we think of as wild in Scotland, there actually isn't a lot of wilderness left there. So yeah, there's a large network of nonprofits and businesses working to rewild and reforest that landscape and bring back endemic species. And like I said, they're kind of doing it. There's basically two kinds of rewilding I've learned about. One's more passive, where you kind of just clear out the invasive species and let nature do its thing, which works, but is often quite slow. So then there's more, of a way to sort of intervene and help speed things along. So they're doing that there too. There's a lot of tree planting and bringing in certain species maybe from other parks and reintroducing them there. But it's a very, very interesting area and very beautiful.
Is it funded? So, like in Chile, it was the Tompkins family, Doug Tompkins, who is a successful businessman who's no longer with us, but we know his wealth was vast. Is
Yeah.
this the scenario also in Scotland? I'm on this website for the Dundragon
Oh, yeah.
Rewilding Estate. So
Yeah.
is it driven by personal philanthropy, or how are these things coming together? Or do you even know?
Yeah, I think it's a mix. It's not, in Patagonia, like it really was the Tompkins Conservation that started all of that. There's not
Mm-hmm.
really sort of one organization. It really is this vast network of organizations and business owners. I spent a few days up at
Mm-hmm.
Allendale Wilderness Reserve, which is outside of Cairngorms National Park. It's farther north in the Highlands. But
Mm-hmm.
they've also done a lot of rewilding work, and that's sort of their whole tourism model up there. So yeah, it's kind of a network of ecotourism businesses plus nonprofits like the Dundragon Center, which they're actually opening a rewilding center that with a lodge that you'll be able to stay at. I think that's set to open next year.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it's kind of there's a lot of players there.
I love that because it feels like um, we can all take some part. I get so frustrated feeling like I just have to wait for somebody who has more wealth or more political
Right,
power to
right,
bring about the changes that I want. And maybe I'm casting my vote, but my guy still doesn't win. And and
mhm,
yet here, travel and these travel experiences and organizations do offer a way into action on
yeah,
big, complicated topics.
yeah.
That I'm gratified by that.
Yes, absolutely. I think you're right. It goes back to, even what we were talking about with the rights of nature movement and,
Mm-hmm.
how tourism sort of plays into that. Absolutely. I think it's once again, it kind of makes those issues accessible. Lets travelers and, everyday people who aren't conservationists and scientists feel like they're actually doing something,
Mm-hmm.
which, like you said, is very gratifying.
So what do you like to, what kind of books do you read? Or do you have time to read? But I'm imagining you're a big reader since
I
most
love
writers
to
are.
read.
Who should we read?
I'm always discovering new authors, I mean, I think in the travel space, I've always really loved Robert Macfarlane. He's a British author and journalist. He
Mm-hmm.
just writes about nature really beautifully.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Sophie Roberts is another journalist. I really love her writing, and she wrote her debut novel, I guess, a couple of years ago now, The Lost Pianos of Siberia, which was
Ooh,
fascinating.
what's that about? I'm going to check that one out. The Lost
Yeah,
Pianos of
it's
Siberia.
really about the Lost Pianos of Siberia. It's very yeah, very kind of just this cultural journey. It starts in Mongolia, and she travels across Siberia, sort of in search of this lost musical culture. And it's just a very compelling narrative too,
Wow.
with a really interesting history.
I love the idea of of becoming passionate about a particular thing,
Right, I do
like
too.
this form of music, and
Yes.
then that becomes the guide for your travel decision making. Maren Krings is another artist for air within Tomorrow's Air, and she's been a big advocate for hemp, industrial hemp, and
Okay.
she was exploring the use of hemp around the world and ended up just, in these crazy places
Yeah.
in around the world, where in Mongolia or in China, I think, and in Germany and Sweden, where people are pioneering different products or uses for hemp. Anyway, that,
Yeah.
this
I
book
totally
about the
agree.
music, I'm like, this is a
Yeah.
thing. This could be, we should
No,
all
I
do this.
agree. I have so much respect and admiration and sort of fascination with people that become laser focused on
Mm-hmm.
such
Mm-hmm.
experts in one sort of small, obscure subject. I think
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's great. And we need those people in the world, right? That
Tell us, because I think I'm nearing the hour here. I know
yeah.
I have to let you go on with your life, but what article is coming up soon? What should we keep a lookout for? I definitely, all these, the pieces you've published, Chloe, are so well researched. I'm
Hmm.
scanning through your rewilding piece in Conde Nast Traveler, and of course, the way we met, are the National Geographic article
Yes.
that mentioned Tomorrow's Air and the other climate initiatives.
Uh,
So I get inspired and educated by your work. What's
Oh,
coming up next?
well, thank you. That's so kind of you to say. And yeah, I really enjoy the research. I always have. I mean, I think whether it's in university or now, I love that part of writing. I love, and sometimes I really go down a rabbit hole with
It makes
books.
it deeper, though. It's better than just a
Yeah, it does.
superficial, like, try the
It
coffee at this shop, that kind of
Yeah,
stuff.
exactly. And usually, or not usually, always with these subjects,
Mm.
I'm always genuinely very curious and interested to learn about them. So yeah, I do. I really enjoy the sort of research and interview process. Um, but yeah, next we'll be writing about Scotland. So yeah, I will be
Mm.
writing a story about the cairngorms and the rewilding that's happening there. I also visited Scotland's 3 UNESCO creative cities. So they launched a
Ooh.
UNESCO heritage trail
Uh-huh.
that was last year, I believe. And yeah, they've included these 3 creative cities in it. So, City of Literature and Design and Music. So, I got to visit those
Wow.
too. Yeah, which was very cool and was
What
a
do they
different.
call the city of literature?
Yeah, that's Edinburgh, the
Mm-hmm.
city of literature. Yeah, just it's sort of long literary history there, and
Mm-hmm.
even now it's a very interesting sort of literary scene. But yeah, I'd also like to write about that. So hopefully we'll be writing about that because I think it's a different way to think about what a sustainable or green city is, and looking at how culture plays into sustainability.
Right.
Hmm.
Right.
Yeah, so those are 2 pieces that, yeah, hopefully I'm looking forward to sharing soon.
Smart destination planning. Well, and I guess there'll be something coming out from your upcoming visit to Botswana and Uganda.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, that as well.
Who knows what might happen on that one. Well, Chloe, thank you so much for making time. And I look forward to talking with you and reading more of your work in the coming days.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for having me, Christina. And yeah, it's always pleasure. Well, I have to say, always a pleasure to chat. I think this is actually our first actual conversation, right? It's always
might be. We've always been virtual. We've been email buddies.
Yeah, it's always been virtual. One day we'll meet in person.